Here today. It's nice to have everybody able to join us. My name is Rob McGarva. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Student Services for the Pembina Hills School Division. And we're also, we'll have a number of guests joining us here during the day. But I'd also like to announce or to introduce Pam Rinaldi. She's a CAS learning consultant who's been heading up the project here.
Thanks, Rob. Welcome, everyone.
And if you haven't had a chance, put your name in the chat and introduce yourself and maybe say a couple of words about optimal learning. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional land of Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Dene, and Nakota Sioux, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. I acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. We at CAS commit to restoring and honoring the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and we strongly believe that truth must be acknowledged to move forward to reconciliation. Together, we call upon all our collective communities to build a stronger understanding of all people who dwell on this land we call home. And I'd also like to personally acknowledge that for many years, I didn't appreciate the treaty lands I grew up on, and I commit to making sure my own children have a better understanding and to furthering truth and reconciliation. On the screen now, we've got the learning outcomes, and these are what we're hoping to come over with today and give you a sense of, hopefully about like 5 minutes, looking at legislation, policy, and frameworks, 15 minutes looking at a continuum of supports and services, and then about 45 minutes where we really dig into the stories of practice and give you opportunities to reflect on your learning. Our work as systems leaders is succinctly described in the professional practice standards. I appreciate how these 3 standards include in the last part of the statement that it'll result in optimum learning for all students. Another image, this shows the components highlighting the intended interactions between the TQS, LQS, and superintendent standards. And today we're really focused on the green part of the image. We appreciate how Alberta Education crafted the standard based on the 1997 TQS to identify the result we are working towards. What's different from the earlier version of the standards is the word all. We appreciate Mark Swanson's article about the professional practice standards. When the new standards first came out, he shared the difference between the first TQS and the updated version. And they're almost exactly the same, except for the addition of the word all. And to quote the article he published back in 1997, quality teaching occurs when the teacher's ongoing analysis of the context and the teacher's decisions about which pedagogical knowledge and abilities to apply result in optimum learning by students. The 2018 says quality teaching occurs when the teacher's ongoing analysis of the context and the teacher's decisions result in optimum learning for all students. The inclusion of the word all reflects a shift in recognition and values for inclusiveness and diversity in the learning environments. This emphasis is seen throughout the document and in particular in the new list of teaching competencies. Another thing to highlight here is that on the image that was produced here, there are people at the center of the image. And these represent our learners. It can represent our teams, staff, parents, and the community that all work together. The competencies describe the intent of the standard and the focus of this session. Although the learning is primarily based on the outcome of the standard, optimum learning for all students, we will focus on the one competency, visionary leadership, and embodying that visionary leadership. Depending on your role in the system and your focus, other competencies might be a focus. As we've all experienced, our competencies are interrelated and interdependent. And you particularly see that when you look at that cast braided image of how all of them work together. But in terms of visionary leadership in the SLQS, superintendents engage with their communities to set a vision for optimum learning for all students. This vision is based on values and beliefs around student success. This vision is for all students. Without this visionary leadership and ongoing stewardship of actions and outcomes, the preferred future will never be achieved. For senior leaders under the LQS, a leader collaborates with the school community to create and implement a shared vision for student success. Principals are key in implementation of the vision, and recognizing the school community's values and aspirations and demonstrating an appreciation for diversity. The importance of superintendents and senior leaders working closely and seeing their roles in a necessary achievement of the vision can't be underestimated. Superintendents lead the community in setting the vision for student success, and senior leaders have a key to ensuring the vision is implemented, and in places they're working more directly with staff, teachers, students, and so on. And most of the recent research on inclusive education continues to highlight the importance of school leaders in making those kind of changes and ensuring that there's success. Depending on your role in the system and your focus, other competencies might be more relevant. So we'd like to do just a little bit of an activity. I've taught junior high before, so I'm not patronizing, it's just a habit to say, let me finish the instructions before you do anything. But think about one of your work colleagues, one who works in a different area than you, and one that may have a different professional background or perspective than you. Which area of the standard, either SLQS or LQS, would their work most relate to in creating a school authority that's inclusive and that results in optimum learning for all students? So think about which of your colleagues you could apply this to, and identify their title and type that into the chat when I say go. For example, you might put in something like the Assistant Superintendent of Finance is focused on LQS 8, managing school and operational resources. So think about that for a second and put it into the chat now.
While they're typing, Rob, I just realized that the headings are switched. The one with the 9 competencies are LQS, and the one with the 7 is SLQS. Sorry about that.
it's a chance to keep people on their toes and see if they know the SLQS. And I see people have identified some examples that they're thinking of, just the people related to curriculum are helping with modeling professional learning, looking at instructional leadership. I know finance people have made a big difference in my world over the years with them understanding what the ultimate goal was, and why sometimes it was hard for me. I'm experiencing that year, why it's hard to specifically budget at a certain time of the year as the landscape keeps changing. And certainly those transportation people. Thank you. I wanted to touch briefly on current legislation, policy, and frameworks in Alberta. And as a group, when we talked about this, some documents stood out as being really important for people to know. And for those of you who are involved in inclusive education, these might be quite familiar. But if you're not, some of them might be not as apparent. You know, primarily there's the Education Act that came out of Inspiring Educations, where Albertans clearly indicated they wanted a system that was more inclusive and robust for all learners. There's also Section 33, which requires school boards to provide a continuum of supports and services consistent with the principles of inclusive education. From that came the Continuum document that we'd asked you to pull up for today, because that was released to support the Education Act and provide more detail and vision of what an inclusive education system would look like. There's the ministerial order that all students have their programming based on the standards set by the minister. The vision is for students to be learning, for all students is to be learning the same. We've had the professional practice standards, which provide competencies for superintendents, for all educational leaders, and for teachers to provide safe, inclusive, and welcoming learning environments that ensure optimal learning for all. I find that the TQS particularly useful when teachers are telling me something isn't their job, and I can point out that it really is. The funding manual has shifted over the years to how districts are funded for learning supports, and it's meant to be used for division-wide supports to support all learners. Learner supports are one of the 5 key domains of the assurance process, where boards have to demonstrate that they have a continuum and that it's effective. In the legal realm, there's the Alberta Human Rights Act that all Albertans, regardless of race, gender, identity, disability, or sexual orientation, are to be afforded the same rights and opportunities. And the Moore decision from BC provides further legal justification. The judge noted that providing accommodations so all students can benefit from education is not, and I quote, a dispensable luxury, unquote. It doesn't necessarily mean a shift, but it means that boards are held accountable for providing specific supports for targeted or individual students. And finally, at the bottom, we have the standards for special education. And this has become a little outdated over the years. I recognize many of the names in the participants here, where I've been involved with them on conversations at CAS about lobbying the government to update the standards. But it's important to remember those standards still exist, because if you get into a legal dilemma, or if there's an appeal made, it's still going to be the standards that the people fall back on to ask whether you've been providing accommodations at all tiers or not. Just thinking about those different pieces of legislation, if you had the opportunity to highlight just one of those to your superintendent or board chair, which one would you use? So if you could put that in the chat, which, if the superintendent or board chair said they wanted to talk about inclusive education, which of the documents do you think would be most important in bringing to their attention?
Oh my gosh.
Now, it's interesting to see what people choose. I see many people have chosen the Continuum document because of the vision that it provides. Although some of you also feel it's important to talk about the legal parts, like the Education Act and the Human Rights Act, and what that requires us to do. The Continuum document is quite helpful in developing and understanding where we're wanting to be going. And Diane's pasted the link into the chat just in case you haven't opened it up yet. Just in terms of kind of polling the audience, could you put into the chat, would you say you're very familiar with this resource, somewhat familiar, or not so much? So it looks like our audience has a reasonable awareness to a very strong awareness. Pam, do you want to talk a little bit about the Continuum document?
Sure. Thank you, Rob. Sorry, I was clicking lots of buttons there.
Oh, sorry. I think I'm working against you.
Yeah, we both have access to the slides, so that could be trouble. Anyway, thank you and welcome everyone. It's really exciting to talk with you and learn from each other about building a system that's more inclusive. And this Continuum document came as a result of the Education Act, which originally was around 2012 that the first version was written, and it was intended to really help the field actualize what we mean by a continuum of supports and how you build a system that's more inclusive. As Rob said, that came out of setting the direction and inspiring education, where we move from an approach where I like Rob I think he said this quote to me that has stuck in my head. It's like, we change the shift of our asking instead of what do you have to what do you need? And that really is what a continuum is all about, is providing the necessary supports and services for all learners so that they can be successful in their learning. And it's based on these really important principles. When you're looking at how to support optimum learning for all students, of course, it has to be learner-centered. Who are your learners? What do they need? Where are their strengths? What different communities do they come from in terms of their background, their culture? All of those pieces are part of who our learners are. And so when you're intentionally designing a continuum of supports and services, that's critical in knowing who not only your learners are, who your staff are, who your communities are. It's strengths-based. All of us have different contexts, and we understand that from different communities have different strengths and different access to different services. And our staff are all at different points in their learning. So how do we build on these strengths to provide the necessary supports for our learners? Key is flexible and responsive. Humans change, our needs change, different kids move into our neighborhood, our communities shift. I think we're seeing a crisis right now in different parts of Alberta, which historically have happened in the past, some fires, floods. That may shift on what your continuum looks like, because those communities may have to look at a more trauma-informed supports and services to be more flexible to their communities as they grow and change. So we can't just design a continuum and go, we're one and done, time to move on, check that box. It always has to be flexible and responsive to your ongoing context. One of the keys about a continuum versus when we think about a tiered approach like an RTI approach is that it's cumulative. Everything, if we all need strong universal practices in the classroom. So evidence-based teaching and learning, connection, social emotional learning, all those strong universal practices, building the capacity of our staff is essential. The supports and services start in the classroom. When we think about Elmore and that pedagogical core and that interaction between teacher, learner, that is critical to have as our universal supports. All learners should have access to targeted and individualized supports. Targeted supports are for those individuals that need, groups of individuals that need something a little bit extra that help them access and overcome perhaps any barriers to learning. And individualized supports are for a fewer amount of students, but could be more intensive. And those intensive supports could be short-term or long-term. But the key is that it's cumulative. All learners have access to universal supports at all times while they're receiving both targeted and individualized. They have to be accessible. Your learners, your community, your staff need to know that there's no barriers to getting supports. It shouldn't take a 15-page application to get some type of support in your classroom. It needs to be accessible without barriers. It needs to be visible. Your learners, your staff, your school leaders, your community should know what your continuum is and how to access it. And it needs to be integrated. When we're talking about a continuum, we're not just talking about academic learning or well-being. The two are so integrated. That's why engaging our colleagues who are leading curriculum change and curriculum development, it's so important that they're part of this conversation as well, that we're integrating supports in those academics as well as well-being. So we try to develop a visual, and as you know, one visual doesn't often able to illustrate everything, but we wanted to try to show the shift from perhaps when we thought of a more RTI approach with that triangular approach, and where kids would, depending on what their needs were or what they qualified for, they would go up the tiers of supports. We want to show supports are surrounding all learners and wanted to use that same visual of the learners in the middle of the standards of optimal learning for all learners in the middle of our visual. Of course, universal is at the center because that is where our supports and services are continuous, need to be strong in the classroom, in the school, and those targeted and individualized supports come in to support the learners and overlap, as some learners may need all those supports at one time. And so that's what we're trying to illustrate in this diagram is a shift to more supports surrounding the learners. One of the keys, if we are looking at that, the document implementing continuum of supports and services, is looking at this integrated approach of being, knowing, and doing. And I want to acknowledge Danica Martin and Lorianne Steinwald from the Alberta government, who was one of the key writers in this, did a presentation in our CAS November conference introducing the continuum, and they use this diagram to show the overlap of the three approaches. And being, knowing, and doing, or a heart, hand, and head approach, they're conceptual frameworks that support change theory, adaptive and transformational leadership. These are adaptive challenges. The being, knowing, and doing approach is based on the research around education systems that are inclusive and inclusive practices. It moves beliefs and values to actions. And that's the power is in that adaptive challenge. And we can't take the one without the other. They're all very integrated. So when we look at being, knowing, and doing, what do we mean by that? Being is that personal effort to understand your beliefs, how that impacts on your decisions and behaviors, and how those actions impact on others. So how do you show up every day as a leader? How do you set your vision about what learning, optimal learning for all students is? What do you really believe about that? And how the conversations you have every day, the learning you take part in, are you demonstrating those values and beliefs about learning for all students? Knowing is that those elements about how you design is kind of that intellectual piece. What are those important elements that need to be in a continuum to maximize success for academics, well-being, and sense of belonging for each student? So that's more our intellectual, what's the strategy? What do we need to plan for? And the doing is, so what? What's the implication of what you provided for your learners? What's the evidence that you're gathering to see that it's actually making a difference? How are you getting people's voices in what's the impact of these supports and services on their learning and their success? So it's really that holistic approach that is key to this work. You can't have one without the other. And so we got asked, why this being, knowing, and doing approach? And what does the research say about this? Being really underpins universal acceptance. It is that way of thinking, acting. It demonstrates how much you value connection and recognizing that everybody brings something new to the table and have gifts and talents that need to be explored and developed. It is really that universal acceptance. When you look at it through an Indigenous lens, it does marry well with the medicine wheel and Indigenous ways of knowing and being, because we're looking at the holistic a holistic approach to this work. So we're looking at not only the intellectual, the knowing and the doing that we're pretty good at from a westernized point of view, but also looking at those values and beliefs. And sometimes those are even the more complicated or more vulnerable things to explore as a leader, but really important that all three of those go together. The research on this, it's really well supported. I don't know if And if you were in CAS, or you can go back through CAS and see some of the work that Dr. Santiago, I cannot say his last name, so I just like to call him Santiago, did for CAS in 2020, which was a leading change in Alberta, mobilizing hearts, heads and hands, and really looking at that being, knowing, and doing. Hearts is your value-based approach. What do you believe is right about education? What do you believe all children, what's the purpose of education? Really coming from that values-based approach. What's your vision? The the heads is the strategy. Where do you want to go? And the hands is mobilizing people together to achieve that vision. Anscow talks about the importance of how teachers' beliefs and values impact so much on pedagogy. We can have the strongest pedagogy in the world happening in a classroom, but a teacher doesn't believe that a child can achieve at the same levels as other children, then that pedagogy falls apart. As well, we can marry that research that Jordan Tinney has brought to us lately in CAS, looking at leading for equity, compassionate leadership. And as we've spoken to, this work is really in the realm of adaptive leadership. Some of our problems can be solved through some technical challenge, but when you're dealing with changes in beliefs, values, shifting systems, those are adaptive challenges. And so that is a really integral part of this work. All right, Rob.
Yeah. And you should have received this document as a way, one tool you could use to reflect back on what your learning is for today, and to jot down some ideas. The other thing we'd ask you to do is add comments to the CAS perspective. If you haven't, I put that in the chat just in case you don't have a link to it. And Claudine is standing by if you have any difficulty logging in. But as I said to Pam when I was looking at the list of attendees, many of you have huge amounts of experience in this area. And it would be great if you could share your knowledge and thoughts as we move along here.
Rob, can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
Some of our participants may not be CAS members, so they don't have access to this. So please put your ideas in the chat, and Claudine or myself, we can cut and paste them into CAS perspectives after the fact. So no worries. We want everybody to have a venue for participation today.
Great. And can we flip back to the slides?
Claudine, there she goes.
Okay. So now we'd like to get a little more into the meat of things. And as Pam said, like being, sometimes we skip over being. I was with our inclusive ed teachers yesterday, and we spent a lot of time on this topic. And for those people who like to get things done, sometimes they just want to move on. But when it gets tough, you really need to be able to know why you're doing what you're doing. So for a kind of detailed discussion of one person's experience, I'd like to welcome Rayanne O'Lyons. She's the Chief Superintendent of Buffalo Trails Public Schools, and and prior to 2020, she was the Assistant Superintendent in Grasslands. And she's extremely excited to be joining Battle River School Division for the next school year. She has over 30 years of experience and truly believes in leading with the head, heart, hands approach. So go ahead, please, Rayanne.
Well, thank you very much. First, I do want to acknowledge that BTPS and the work shift of inclusion has happened here long before my arrival 3 years ago. But the focus question for me is to share my being and how being is so foundational to the continuum of supports and services. I'm glad you indicated that being is tough, because I did find this one took me some reflection. And it's tough to isolate without talking about the action and the moving forward and the next step. However, it's so important for us to start by thinking and reflecting about who we are as leaders, what made us who we are, what our character, our identity, and our beliefs are, that lens of which we see things, as these are all immersed in our daily actions. So being really is how we show up every day. And I'll begin my story, my being, with a little story of when I was 7 years old and I lived in a very small town. It had a school that was separate for children with disabilities. Children lived in this school. They lived away from families. The school was housed in an old building. It was separate from our other schools in the town, a distance from the playground. Sometimes I remember seeing these children, but they didn't have an opportunity to come to our playground. And the kids, they were just so separate from all the other kids their age. And at that young age, I knew I would not want to be sent away from my family. And I remember feeling so very sad for these children and really wondering why they couldn't be with the rest of the kids their age. So at a very young age, I knew that something in this situation wasn't right. It didn't seem fair. And I knew I wouldn't want to be separated from my family. So kind of from a young age, I knew I wanted to be part of making everyone feel welcomed and valued. And now, as a leader, I have that opportunity to embody visionary leadership and communicate my philosophy. So when we look at BTPS and the geographical area, it is so large. And I know that my vision and beliefs and how I see the world, my being, it has to be demonstrated every single day as I try to lead and establish that inclusive learning environment. And my being, it definitely aligns with San Diego's article in CAS 2020 when he speaks about leadership through the heart, the head, and the hand. And we do have to lead by knowing ourselves. So I am truly driven by a personal belief that every individual deserves to feel included and valued. And I want to make a difference. And I don't want any child to feel like those children I saw when I was 7 in that school, far away from home, without being included with the rest of the children's. I don't want people to feel separate or segregated. Another impactful discussion for me and an event that's very clear in my mind, I was 15 years old. I remember where I was driving with my mom in the car on the way to the laundromat, and she was telling me about the Indian Act and how women who were Indigenous lost their rights when they married a man off reserve, and then they lost status and rights that came with that. And I remember this discussion and questioning this with my mom, and how is this right and how is this fair? And just another conversation that my mom planted a seed, and it really truly ignited a passion for social justice and equality. And it's one of those moments throughout my early life that I did realize the life isn't fair and that we all needed to work together and make things different and better. So I do know that upon reflection, my being and who I am, it did begin so early in my life with some events and some discussions and seed planting that had such a profound impact on who I am. So that has guided my being. And now I would say in my work, I'm such a huge advocate for inclusion and equity, to the part where being is really a fundamental human right. And I'm so glad that the Alberta Human Rights Act, it was linked for us on that earlier slide, because I do believe since I was very young and now as an educational leader, it's my responsibility to ensure that our school community, everyone feels safe and valued, and that we are inclusive in so many ways. I feel this is a moral obligation to all of us here as leaders, to be inclusive and have me fulfill my professional duties. So some of those personal beliefs that I have impact my messages. Being is how we be human. We talked about how we show up every day. I am very intentional in my pursuits of creating that inclusive and diverse environment. And I know that we can't do this alone. We have to build relationships. We have to empower and encourage others to share their messages of inclusion. And diversity happens through so many partnerships and relationships. I do believe that by bringing in those diverse voices and experiences and stories, people who can share their stories, so that all students and staff can see themselves reflected back. So it's not just me, it's through that collective voice, those collective relationships and partnerships, that people will feel valued and heard. So when we talk about bringing heart to the table and showing up every day, it's just so important that people know we lead by the heart, the head, and the hand. And through my heart, I hope to bring those daily actions and commitment to that strong belief that we have to create that positive impact on the lives of students, families, and staff, and the communities that I have an opportunity to serve. Earlier, we said being starts by thinking and reflecting on who we are as leaders, our character, our identity, our beliefs, that lens of which we see things, to examine that lens. And sometimes people will tell me, I see the world through those rose-colored glasses. You all know that analogy. But I also think that when we see it, we can create it. So again, that heart is just so important. So leadership and learning matters. I believe, again, education is such a powerful tool which we can change the world. That Nelson Mandela quote. And I believe that I'm so dedicated to ensuring that we use education in so many forms to ensure we change the world. So we see it through that lens that we are trying to create. So effective leadership, it involves knowing ourselves, leading by example, empowering others, building those relationships, having other people share their stories. And as visionary leaders, we need to be holding being in the same regard as pedagogy and expertise. So we really have to know our being and ourselves to be able to do that. So when I kind of sum it up, and leading by our values, our beliefs, our being, how we show up, and the impact, I think of a couple core quotes. And the first one is the Maya Angelou one that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And it's not what we say or what we do, but at the end of the day, people will remember how we made them feel. So that's really our being. And then that starfish story. And I know Barry was always great about sharing the starfish story and making that difference with just that one. And ensuring that we're able to do that, because it's every child, every day. And through our being and how we be human, we can have that positive impact on the lives of every learner, staff, and families to create that place. And it really begins, we have to know ourselves, know our being, our stories, and how we be human can impact lives. So thank you for listening to my story of being.
Well, and thanks for sharing your story of being. It's helpful to understand how other leaders, how they show up and be human and see their moral obligation. Any quick questions or comments anybody wants to make?
Rayanne, I have a quick question. In your work across your district, how have you entered into conversations with school leaders or teachers around being, what's been, what's been your process of trying to engage people in more of those conversations?
So good questions. And, sometimes I think that doing part and the action part is so much simpler than to talk about the being. And some of those happen through, we have for the past 3 years, we have a women in leadership group and trying to encourage those discussions about diversity and gender. We have discussions with partners of First Nations and how we can ensure that we have inclusion for our First Nation, Métis and Inuit families and students within the division, but also how can we educate the surrounding community on why we do some of the things that we do. Many of the discussions are one-on-one. I truly believe in that starfish and helping every student feel supported in the schools, and it's having those conversations with the principals of what we need to do to ensure that each student has that optimal learning environment and is able to be successful. So those would be some of the things. We have a podcast. We ensure that we have voices, gender diversity. We have someone with that has transitioned. We have people who are in different occupations that would be able to share their stories and their voices so people can hear from not just me, but why that's important from other people.
Thanks very much. Sorry, my other question is around boards. How do you engage your board in this conversation?
So I appreciated the question early on when people said, well, which documents, if you're talking to the superintendent or the board, being the superintendent, it was, if I was talking to the board and ensuring that we wanted to continue to have that inclusive learning environment, some of the things are the obligations that we need to have as a division. We are obligated, to ensure every student has that safe learning environment. And I'm so glad there are documents and regulations, acts that we're able to bring those to the table, because it shows the importance that we're all doing this. And it is that fundamental right for every student in our school division, in our province, to feel included, to feel valued, to feel safe. So it's using those documents to ensure the board's aware of why we're doing what we're doing.
Thanks.
Thanks. Just I see Claudine is thanks again, Rianne. And I see Claudine has posted again, just to remind you to put your thoughts into the CAS perspective. We really learn a lot from each other's stories. And I know being part of people's experiences can be quite personal, and you sometimes have to be vulnerable. But if you feel comfortable, it's nice if you can share your story. And I think Pam's showing some of the stories that have been shared so far.
Yes, I put one in, Monica's put one in. And so, yeah, this is, and Rayanne, your story today was really impactful as well. They're kind of probably something that takes a little bit more reflection and be a bit vulnerable. And so we welcome you to populate that with your stories, because the more stories we have, the richer our learning is. Thanks.
And we'll move on now to focusing on the knowing aspect. And we're lucky to have with us, we have Hugh Lair. He's the Associate Superintendent of Learning Services for the Medicine Hat Catholic School Board. And he's been in that position for 14 years. He's a former teacher and administrator and a lifelong child advocate. And he's joined by Monica Bratt, their inclusive education consultant. I'll let them go ahead here.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Rayanne, for your passion. Love the story. Actually, it's Dr. Monica Bratt. Monica received her doctorate last year in neurology and
the educational leadership.
focus on neurology.
No, I focused universal design for learning. My master's was neurology.
She is deep into the knowing of many things. So we work very closely together, and so that's why I've included her with me in this presentation. So welcome everybody. Our task is to focus on the knowing. We really wanted to develop our understanding of what is a continuum of supports and services, and then do we have a continuum of supports and services? So our first step was to really look at within our division, do we have universal, targeted, and individualized supports? So starting with the knowing, the biggest thing for us was designing our continuum.
And I think when we really looked at like this, we actually tapped into this document a lot because we started this work at around the same time this document came out. So really saw the value in this document in regards to supporting our knowing. And I think this knowing part, like that designing term, is absolutely critical to understand it as an active process and an ongoing process to really know and always know a little bit deeper each time we reflect on things.
Okay, so first, like I said, we wanted to define what is a continuum of supports and services. What are those supports that students can access in our classrooms, in our schools? And then what are the services that we provide? What are the people that we have in our buildings? And then how do we organize our schools in these tiers within the continuum? And I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. Secondly, we want to ensure that our department, our division structures align with their continuum supports and services. Do they align with the
Essential elements.
The essential elements? Yes. And then we wanted to explore our essential elements, which is kind of where we're going into our next steps. Really, do we have, looking at each essential element within our schools, for example, like our collaborative structures, do we have division collaborative structures? Do the schools have collaborative structures within each building? So that's the work we're going to be doing moving forward. But like I said, we wanted to purposefully look at adding a tier. Everyone's pretty familiar with universal, targeted, and then specialized. The difference here is we always have a strong focus on universal. We know that you put the effort in there so kids don't float up the tiers, but we wanted to add targeted school into our continuum because we found we were almost jumping from universal up to individualized. So we needed to look at what supports, what people and what supports we had, not only in the targeted classroom level, but also targeted school. Were schools able to do a lot of problem solving on their own? And do they have the people to do that? So in understanding what we needed for a continuum, we really had to restructure who we had in our schools and add levels of service, levels of support, so schools can take care of many of the, or I guess problem solve on their own with teams, but we had to put people in place. So a lot of our first work before we even got to the elements was that restructuring of our department and what are the supports and services we have in our division. And it's important, and it's in the document to note that there's the supports and services that are tiered and not the learners.
This is really just an extension of what he was saying. So like we really wanted to that cumulative piece was really important, but also to understand kind of that we're moving up that continuum and we're adding on to what we had, and then thinking about where are those people and how do those people like in the higher levels support those lower levels as well. Okay, then we started looking like, so once we had kind of that feeling of, you know, here's our continuum, and we worked with division leadership team, really kind of thinking through that continuum, we started looking at the essential elements. And this was really a first dive into the essential elements. So we brought our division leadership team together and just did a quick overview of each of the essential elements and started doing some brainstorming in groups around, you know, what are our current successes and challenges within each of those elements, just to get a feel kind of where we were to begin with. And then once we had that in the same session, we also looked at each of those essential elements through those design principles that Pam has talked about kind of earlier on. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So we really looked at each of the essential elements. So we looked at, you know, collaborative practices, and we thought about like right now with what we're doing, are they learner-centered? Are they strength-based? So we kind of dug down into that a little bit. And this was really just a starting point to get people familiar with those design principles, because we're going to continue to use them as we keep understanding and knowing this continuum of sports more. Well, that was yours.
This one?
Well, no, I think I did yours.
Oh, well, you did a great job. That's okay. We'll move on.
Okay, you want me to keep going?
Yep.
Okay. I think then our next step, and we're kind of just jumping into this step now, is we're going to take each of those essential elements, and over the next couple of years, actually, we want to look at each essential element and dig deeper into those essential elements and really check, are we implementing with them with those design principles in mind, but also have a feel for where we are. And as we know where we are, we're able to look at what we can do next. So what do we need for professional development? What do we need for structures? What can our next step be? What's that action step? And we just feel like really knowing it is going to lead to that action step. So what we're looking at creating and kind of co-creating with our division leadership team are practice profiles, which are just living documents that really outline the core practices. So we would take, for example, this is a starting point of one of them, collaborative practices. And from that document, that continuum document that Alberta Education has put out, we're actually pulling out the key ideas under collaborative practices, and then just expanding on it a little bit more with some of the research around collaborative practices and creating a continuum of when is it effective and what would it look like if it was in the developmental stage, and what would it look like if it was ineffective. And we're going to be working with division leadership team to really dig down into this practice profile, and then go back to their schools and look at, you know, where are we at on this continuum, and then really start to think about how does learning services as a division and schools work together to continue to move forward on these continuums.
Yep. So it really was, I guess, a two-step process. First of all, we really had to understand what is a continuum of supports and services. Do we have gaps that we need to fill? And then we want to analyze the elements within the continuum. Okay. 10 minutes. Bang on, right, Pam?
Guys are very good. I'm sure people have lots of questions. I love your idea of those practice profiles. So we'll open it up for some questions. No questions?
Usually means we did a great job or not
That's
so great. Sure.
That's right.
I would say it was a great job. I appreciated you talking about the process you'd used and that it's an ongoing process, that you're not ever just done.
Yeah, the whole being, knowing, and then doing is cyclical. It's intertwined, and you almost keep repeating it over and over again.
And I think I agree with what Pam said. I think those practice profiles sound quite exciting to help people dig deeper and really think about whether they're getting to those essential elements.
Exactly.
Are you going to have each school then develop their continuum, like, so their collaborative structure continuum, or, you know, their continuum around learning, continuum around well-being, mental health?
Yeah, each school is going to go through a practice profile in each of the 7 elements. So they're going to be reflecting on their collaborative structures, on their approaches and supports, on their how they manage their resources, how they do transitions. Like I said, this is not going to be a quick process. It'll take probably a couple of years to get through all this. But intertwined in that is developing that sense of being. It's developing that greater sense of knowing what we do, what we have, and what we need. It is a really reflective practice.
And it's also, I think, a feedback loop for us at the division too, like what does the school have and what needs to come in addition to that, right? So that we're getting everything at the right place. So
That's awesome.
Well, thank you. And just again, a reminder to share any thoughts, ideas you have about the knowing part.
If anybody has been doing similar work to Hugh and Monica around the different elements around the continuum, please go into Cast Perspectives and put that in there now. Or if you want to add your ideas in the chat, that's great too. So maybe we'll just give everybody just a couple of minutes to think about that. And if they've got anything to add, we can add that to the chat or the perspectives.
I had a question.
Go ahead.
Hugh and Monica, can you give us an example how you've seen a change at the school level through this experience?
Well, I can't say we've maybe seen a change yet, but we have opened their eyes to maybe what's coming. When we started to introduce and look at the 7 elements and really understand, we worked with the administrators on really what they're talking about. Like when you're talking about collaborative structures, what does that mean? If you're talking about assessment structures, what does that mean? Are we just talking level C? No, we're not. We're talking level A, B, C. Do we have common practices? So really in those discussions of understanding the 7 elements, and that's where we've started, they've already started to question, almost jump ahead that, oh my goodness, we don't have collaborative structures. We have one, but we don't have a chance for teachers to get together. So I think it's just started to open their eyes about what's coming, to be more reflective themselves on their schools. And it's not just division. It's not just learning services. We're there to support the schools in their work. So it's really taking more ownership on, these are things they're working on in their school, and we're there to support them through it.
and I think one of the other things, like, and it's not quite at the school level yet, but even in those discussions with administrators, just a greater awareness too of how, like, what we're doing has to carry forward from elementary schools to junior high to senior high. Some of that came up as we started kind of evaluating what everybody's doing. So that connection of what we're doing across the division. And I do think it's mostly right now at that point where people are seeing potentially some of those gaps and then thinking through the next steps.
Thank you for that.
I have a quick question too. I'm just wondering, are you looking for consistency of practice across your division? Like, are there some standards that you say, we really want to see this across our division, or these are the divisional level standards that we are hoping, or processes that we're hoping to see?
I would say that's definitely a goal as we go through this, and as administrators share what their practices are, they're sort of learning from each other. And I think that we'll have more. I think it's just important to understand what a continuum is and what supports should be. And if the supports are there, then it's a matter of, well, what are they doing? And I think that commonality will come out as they work through it and share together.
And I think the practice profile will give a bit of that standard too of what we're looking for, because here's the effective practice. So that's kind of that overriding practice that we're looking for.
Yeah, the practice profile sort of gives them a picture of this is not what it looks like. You're kind of getting there, and this is what it should look like, which kind of creates that common practice.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I could see how that would be very effective, having something people could strive towards. I have to go have a couple of crucial conversations with schools tomorrow, and I was thinking it would be really nice to have something like that that would lead them to the conclusion that I'm hoping I can get them to.
Yeah.
That gentle nudge of, hey,
Yeah.
Well, and the practice profile is also meant to like really, it's rooted in implementation science, and it's meant to also give like kind of that feedback around what professional learning should be focusing on, how resources should be distributed, how do you set goals, those kind of things as well.
Well, thanks very much, you and Monica. That was very interesting.
thank you.
Now we'd like to move on to the doing part, and we're lucky to be joined by Danica Martin, the Assistant Superintendent at Wolf Creek. Go ahead, Danica.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for the two stories that came before me. I think we've seen as we've worked through the stories how intertwined the being, knowing, and doing are. So I would just like to take a few minutes to highlight broad strokes of some of the work we've done in Wolf Creek over the past 5 years in terms of creating an inclusive system for all of our students. And then I'll spend a little bit of time focused on what we're specifically doing right now and even last week at our Administrator Association meeting using this document and this concept of a continuum of supports to move that work forward and really dig into the doing component of the continuum. So here we go. If we can flip to the next slide, please. Wolf Creek Public Schools has 3 priority areas. You can see them there with our pencil graphics. So our motto sort of is getting to the point in Wolf Creek, and our focus areas are quality teaching, supporting all student and collective responsibility. So over the past couple of years at Wolf Creek, we have had a bit of a focus on inclusion. And we have really looked systematically at what our vision as a system for inclusion is, and how do our structures and processes as a system align with that vision or not align with that vision. And so just broad strokes, we have taken some action in terms of the doing component systematically over the past few years to really look at streamlining our processes and structures from a central office perspective, a focus on service and support rather than paperwork and identifying students and over identifying students and those kinds of othering type of processes that sometimes exist. We've partnered that with really focused work with our administrators on building their instructional leadership capacity so that inclusion became part of the work that we do as instructional leaders in our district, rather than separate work sort of down the hall that somebody else with a different title does. And so that's been a focus all throughout all levels of our system, even to the point where we ended up merging our learning services and inclusive learning services departments at the system level into one team, now called Education Services, that spans all of teaching and learning from pre-K to grade 12 across the entire continuum of supports all in one department. So even structurally, some of those changes that we've made have been purposeful and strategic. So just to get to the nitty gritty of where we're at now, moving into next year, 23-24, our engagement data has really highlighted a need, a recognition of the increasing complexity in our classrooms, as I'm sure you're all seeing, a recognition of the mental health needs, both in our students and our staff that are creeping up there. And so the focus for next year is really about supporting all of our students. And so at the senior team level, we chose to focus on the continuum of supports document as a foundation for our planning. And so on the next slide, you'll start to see some of the work that happened actually just last week, Thursday and Friday. We had our administrators together for 2 days of planning, and the content of that time together was really focused on walking them through the entire continuum of supports document. In these pictures here, you'll see sort of a little focus on the being piece where they each had a little person that was created and they had to sort of reflect on their own where they're at on their own journeys towards being. And then on the next slide, we get into more of that placemat activity that we really spent a good portion of our time on, where we had our administrators thinking about what within their schools, in terms of those 7 elements of the continuum of the supports, what do they have in place in terms of universal, targeted, and individualized supports, services, structures, and processes in their schools. Our central office teams were also mirroring this activity. And so, this will give us systematically some really good information school by school about where the strengths are in our system, where the stretches are, and how we can work together as an organization to help schools meet those strengths and stretches. And so I think on the next slide, we just have some photo evidence of that in action. And our administrators really took this seriously and spent a good portion of the afternoon on those planning days, really thinking about what is it that they're offering at their school to hit all of those areas. Of course, what they found and what you find as you work through the document is that something might fit in collaborative structures, but it also fits in assessment processes or, approaches and supports and some of the other. So there's lots of overlap, but even the thought process that we saw them walk through and the conversations that were happening at the admin team tables last week were amazingly rich and valuable. If we just flip to the next slide, please. Yeah, just a few more pictures. And so the questions at the top come directly, from the Continuum of Supports document and really guided our admin through this planning process. And so on the next slide, we took it a step further the following morning and we asked them to really work through that doing cycle that's outlined both in the funding framework, but also at the end of the Continuum of Supports document. We asked them to pick one area from their placemat work that they might have noticed that there was, a bit of a gap. Maybe they didn't have as many things written across that row for that element. Or maybe they wanted to choose the being, knowing, doing components, one of those 3 areas as a priority for their school. And so we asked them to work through that explore, develop, evaluate, take action planning cycle around one specific component of their own school's continuum of supports. And then this slide was actually mirrored in their, we provide our schools in Wolf Creek with a strategic planning template that they all use for their school-based education plans. And so we mirrored this slide in their ACE plans, we call them ACE plans. And so as we move through next year, we'll have this ongoing conversation and level of accountability and sort of tracking school by school about a particular area of focus that they've chosen along that continuum of supports. And then of course, as a system, the ability to come alongside them and work with them and support them at that systematic level as they engage at that work at the school level. And I think that is the end of my story.
Thanks. That's I appreciate you explicitly showing how you worked through this process. A lot of times people vaguely tell you how they've been working on things, but that provides a really good picture of how you worked through it. Are there any questions for Danica?
What ideas or evidence are you gathering as a district or looking at from a district point of view that, your principals, your schools are growing in this area? What evidence are you're going to be looking for, Danica? For
sure. So part of their ACE plan slide is for them to reflect on their own evidence that they'll be collecting. So that will be one thing that we will be monitoring throughout the year. Systematically, we also produced a learning plan for our administrator association that is aligned with the elements of the continuum of support. And we mirrored that for our schools, including some tights and looses in that learning plan. So we have several aligned calendar Fridays throughout the school year. And we actually handed our administrators last week a learning plan with many components of those days sort of as tights For example, collaborative response model time, which is a collaborative structure, is a tight and has to find its way onto some of those Fridays. And then there were other tights throughout. And so that will be another piece of evidence that we'll collect as we look at agendas from those days. We'll be popping into those days as a senior team to see what's happening, in action at the school site on those days. So those are just two examples of some of the evidence that we'll be collecting throughout the year.
Awesome. Yeah. And I have one more question, and this is probably for your school leaders. How are they collecting student voice in this?
So many of our schools have student action groups or student advisory groups that they're consulting with. We have a divisional student engagement group that we bring together students from grade 7 to 12 to gather that feedback. But I would also say that as they were even going through that placemat and thinking about their own continuums of support, you could hear them even discussing individual students, because many of our administrators, especially since inclusion has become part of their portfolio area formally over the past few years, they really have a good sense of the needs in their building. And they can talk through particular students and particular supports and services that exist for those students within that placemat. And so, it's not maybe a direct student voice, but an indirect student voice, because they know their audience for sure.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll give you a minute or two here to enter any ideas or thoughts you have.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Danica. And I just want to say thank you to our three presenters, or our three, Rayanne and Monica and Hugh and Danica, by sharing your stories. That makes our learning all the more richer. And you've shared some really great templates and resources that you're using, and hopefully through some of that work we'll be able to share some of the things that you've been doing with others. So the purpose of this is not to reinvent the wheel either. So you showed us some really, really great resources. So yeah, we would ask you to consider, all of you on today, to continue to share your thoughts, your ideas, your work around implementing this continuum of supports and services, and contribute that to the CAS perspectives. That would be very awesome if you could do that. I want to acknowledge that really this webinar and the work that we're doing, this webinar is one of the pieces of the learning that CAS is providing to members, but we're also going to be working on a short course that's part of the CAS continuing education program and certification, and more on that later. But we're working on a short course that will dive deeper into this whole idea around continuums of supports and services that support optimal learning for all students. But we couldn't have done this work without the contribution of our committee that have come together and have really given their ideas, their expertise, their time to these really important concepts that we want to make sure all CAS members have access to. And these are, as you can see, we're represented right across the province, and large boards, rural boards, we have francophone boards. So it's been a really good cross-section of people working on this and adding their contribution to this work. So thank you very much to the committee. I'm not going to read all of their names, but They have made important contributions for sure. And I also I especially want to thank Rob too today for stepping up and being our facilitator. Great job, Rob. Thanks very much. And he's been a big part of our committee. And it is nerve-wracking, as you know, to present in front of colleagues and put yourself out there. So again, I want to say thank you to our Stories of Practice, because that's definitely a vulnerable place to put yourself in to share, and we really appreciate it. Going forward, as I said, we are going to continue as CAS as an organization to support your learning in actualizing the SLQS and the LQS. This work around continuum of supports and services and optimal learning for all students is only one piece of the continuing education program that CAS will be rolling out over the next year or so. We also want to highlight that we have lots of resources already available on the CAS website that can support your learning today. If you want to dig deeper, we have, I think Claudine put the links to those resources in the chat, but as we mentioned before, there's the work that Jordan Tinney has done recently around leading for equity, compassionate leadership, adaptive leadership, contextual literacy. We have the CAS professional learning module, leading for inclusion, that was done a number of years ago, that also has some really great resources. So CAS already has a great library of resources that we can tap into as members and help to support our own learning and growth in a division. So I just want to thank you all for participating in our conversations, and we've got a couple of minutes left, and just want to open the floor if there's any questions of any of our presenters or anything about going forward with this work that CAS is doing or the Continuum. We'd be happy to entertain any questions at this time. Hearing none. Rob, do you want to close us off today?
Sure. Yeah, no, and I'd like to thank all the people who contributed today and for all of you attending, and just encourage you to continue to share your stories, and I certainly enjoyed my morning. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.